Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a good day and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Stephen Bogado. I am an economist here at FocusEconomics and I work closely on the Latin American region. FocusEconomics provides analysis and consensus forecasts for 132 countries and 34 commodities, both in our monthly economic intelligence reports and online via our Focus Analytics platform. We work with a network of over 1,200 local and global analysts to produce our consensus forecasts for more than 30 key economic indicators. In this webinar, I'll be discussing the economic outlook for Latin America next year. I'll start with a basic overview of 2021 and the current state of play. Then I'll proceed by going over our outlook for 2022 and the main challenges facing the region. I'll also touch on the key political developments in store for next year and provide an overview of the individual outlook for Latin America's main economies. Let's begin with a brief overview of 2021. The regional economy returned to growth in the first half, clocking a 17.1% expansion in Q2, after a dismal 2020 which saw Latin America suffer the largest fall in real GDP out of all the major world regions. A surging US economy has been an important boost this year, supporting remittances, exports, and tourist arrivals, particularly in those economies most closely locked into the US economic orbit, such as Mexico and Central America. Also, higher prices for many important commodities such as oil, copper, and soybeans have boosted exports and government coffers. However, a highly supportive base effect has also played a role in flattering annual growth figures, and underlying momentum has been fairly soft. If we look at quarter-on-quarter data, to strip out the annual base effect, we see that several key LATAM economies actually contracted in Q2 as a new wave of COVID-19 struck the continent. Turning to the second half of the year, signs are more positive. COVID-19 cases have tumbled recently as the vaccination campaign has accelerated, which should be boosting consumer confidence. Moreover, lockdown restrictions have consequently been pared back across the region, as shown by figures from the COVID-19 Stringency Index, which measures the degree of restrictive measures in place, aiding domestic demand. That said, new concerns are emerging. Chief among them is surging inflation in many countries, which is eating into disposable income. As a result, central bankers are hiking rates aggressively, weighing on lending activity. Looking at our projections for 2021 as a whole, we can see that they have been revised up radically since the outset of the year. From the 4.2% growth expected in our January report, the analysts we poll now expect Latin America to grow 6.4% this year. The reasons for this upward revisal are manifold, but three main factors stand out. A growing economic resilience to fresh lockdown measures as consumers and firms have become better adapted and more able to shift activity online, the unforeseen across-the-board surge in commodity prices, and trillions of dollars of fresh US stimulus measures under the Biden administration. Growth in Latin America is set to slow sharply next year, to 2.6% according to our consensus forecast. Less expansive fiscal and monetary policies will be an important reason why, as governments wind down pandemic-related measures and central banks battle to contain price pressures. We also see some pullback in commodity prices next year as the post-pandemic spurt in global activity cools and temporary supply constraints ease. At the same time, other factors will support momentum. Tourist arrivals should move back towards their pre-pandemic levels next year, for instance. Many Latin American countries have kept strict entry requirements in place since the start of the COVID-19 crisis and are only now beginning to ease up. Argentina and Chile have only recently opened their borders, for example. As such, there is a lot of scope for visitor arrivals to pick up next year, boosting export earnings and local employment. Other lingering COVID-19 restrictions should also be phased out next year, while two new stimulus packages recently in the US, one covering infrastructure and other social spending, should support remittances, exports and tourism in Latin America in 2022. Risks to the outlook exist in both directions, but appear skewed to the downside. First and foremost, further flare-ups of new vaccine-resistant COVID-19 variants. That said, if this occurs, economic damage should be much more limited than during previous waves. Governments would likely be reluctant to reimpose sweeping lockdowns, while economic agents are increasingly immune to restrictions. Social and political unrest will also be an important factor to watch. Relations between citizens and political elites were already frayed going into the COVID-19 crisis in countries such as Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru saw large protest movements in 2019-2020. The pandemic has only deepened these fault lines between the rich and the rest. Plus, there are several important political events coming up next year that have the potential to fan uncertainty and unrest. General elections in both Brazil and Colombia, and the conclusion of the rewriting of the constitution in Chile following presidential elections at end 2021. I will cover these three events in more detail later in the presentation. Faster than expected monetary tightening is another concern. On the upside, a possible continuation of the commodity price boom, while not the base case of the analysts that we poll, would aid exports and government spending, and there is the potential for some external funding from the G7's Build Back Better World program announced earlier this year as a counterweight to China's Belt and Road Initiative. More broadly, the underlying picture of weak regional growth potential remains in place, and Latin America is expected to underperform other emerging markets next year and in the years that follow. Current elevated commodity prices might in normal circumstances have provided the fiscal room for governments to make productivity-enhancing investments and close the infrastructure investment gap, which was estimated in 2019 by the Inter-American Development Bank to run to $150 billion annually. However, crisis-related spending demands and already weak fiscal metrics limit the room for maneuver. Moreover, although hardly unique to Latin America, the region is highly prone to populist policymaking given the historic failures of political leaders to meet citizens' aspirations. Even Chile, a former bastion of business-friendly politics, is no longer exempt, as exemplified by successive Congress-approved drawdowns from private pension funds during the COVID-19 crisis. This means the region is not currently pursuing the structural reforms necessarily to move away from a reliance on primary commodities and into higher-end manufacturing and services, and consequently onto a higher growth path. In order to understand how inflation will fare next year, it's important to first examine the factors that have been spurring price pressures in recent months. Some are exogenous, such as high global commodity prices and supply constraints now familiar to everyone. Others are country-specific. Brazil, for example, has been suffering from the worst drought in almost a century, hampering electricity supply. Inflation in Chile has been stoked by repeated drawdowns from pension pots and other fiscal stimulus measures. The external factors that have fanned inflation this year should certainly lessen in 2022, as global supply constraints ease and the commodity prices tail off. As such, our analysts expect consumer price inflation in Latin America to average 8.9% in 2022, down from an expected 9.6% this year in 2021. That said, risks are tilted to the upside. For one, supply constraints have proved more persistent than expected in recent months, and this could continue to be the case through at least early 2022. Plus, a new external factor could emerge in the form of tighter Federal Reserve monetary policy. Tapering, a reduction in the pace of the Fed's monthly asset purchases, is underway, and many of our panelists now expect the bank to hike rates sometime in 2022. This could spur capital outflows, weighing on regional currencies and consequently causing inflation to rise. New domestic upside factors could also emerge in the form of political uncertainty. Brazil, Chile, and Colombia are the most obvious candidates given elections over the next 12 months. Peru is another potential flashpoint given persistent frictions between the executive and the legislature and the short shelf life of recent presidents, while instability in Argentina could intensify if negotiations with the IMF over a revamped bailout package break down. In Ecuador, even though economic prospects have improved under President Lasso, a weak parliamentary base could stall reforms and test investors' patience. Moreover, pushback from citizens is likely. Recent fuel price hikes were met by protests and roadblocks, for instance. More generally, social tensions could boil over in many countries in the region, with the potential for notable economic disruption. Possible social turmoil could generate additional currency pressure on the top of the impact of the Fed's tightening. As a result of the upside risks to price pressures, our consensus is for additional rate hikes by regional central banks next year, albeit to a lesser extent than in 2021. Central banks have front-loaded their tightening in a bid to nip inflation in the bud, and they are now way ahead of the curve relative to other global central banks. Regional rates are seen rising to 9.9% at end 2022 from 8.9% at the end of 2021. That said, several factors are likely to limit the effectiveness of monetary tightening in bringing down inflation. A lack of policy credibility in some countries amid ingrained high inflation expectations is one issue. The large number of people working in the informal economy, and thus relatively untouched by changes in lending and deposit rates, is another. And the political tensions I mentioned earlier could overshadow higher interest rates in the eyes of foreign investors, maintaining pressure on currencies regardless. Let's take a look at the key political events on the horizon for next year. We'll start with Brazil, where parliamentary and presidential elections will be held on the 2nd of October 2022. They will likely pit incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro against Lula da Silva, the leftist former president, although he has not yet formally announced his candidacy. Polls currently put Lula way ahead, although an expected fall in unemployment next year, together with possible further fiscal stimulus, could help Bolsonaro close the gap. Victory for Lula would likely herald a more interventionist economic policy than under Bolsonaro and a greater focus on social spending. However, any room to expand the role of the state will likely be limited by the need to reach across the aisle to secure the support of Congress and by the perilous fiscal situation. Public debt is over 80% of GDP, high for emerging markets, while debt interest payments were 24% of revenue in 2019, according to World Bank data. This will also limit the scope for Lula to undo the 2019 pension reform. Moreover, during his first stint as president in 2003 to 2010, his governing style was pragmatic, combining extra help for the poor with paying off Brazil's IMF loan and keeping inflation and public debt in check. He is likely to govern in a similar style this time around. In the surprise event that Bolsonaro retains the presidency, he is likely to reattempt to pass the liberalizing reforms which have stalled during his current term, such as a simplification of the tax system and an administrative reform of the state. However, the political frictions that have hampered progress over the last few years would likely remain in place. And tensions with other branches of the state, such as the courts, would likely remain elevated. Tensions are likely to run high leading up to and in the immediate aftermath of the vote, given the polarizing nature of both candidates and Bolsonaro's recent suggestions that he may refuse to accept the outcome of the elections. As such, be prepared for possible bouts of social unrest and for the real to exhibit volatility next year. On the fiscal front, extra spending is likely under the Auxílio Brasil program. While this could support private consumption in the near term, the effect could be partially offset by ensuing investor concerns over fiscal sustainability, which could cause capital outflows and tighter financial conditions. Now let's turn to Chile. The country's Constituent Assembly, elected earlier this year with an overwhelming majority of leftist and independent candidates, is currently due to finish work on a new constitution by July 2022 at the latest. This will be followed by a referendum on the new text in the second half of the year. Given the immense social pressure and the fact that the right-wing parties failed to secure a one-third blocking minority, the Assembly is likely to come to an agreement in time, although this is not guaranteed. A failure to agree on a constitution, or a subsequent rejection by citizens in the exit referendum, could throw the political system into disarray and lead to renewed social unrest. Assuming the new constitution is drawn up and comes into force, it is likely to enhance the role of the state in areas such as public pensions, healthcare, education, and environmental protection. On this point, the exact wording will be important. Will the new social rights enshrined in the constitution be merely aspirational, for instance, or legally binding obligations that future governments will be forced to follow? In any case, the direction of travel is clear. Chile is likely to become a less economically liberal country in the years ahead, prioritizing greater equality over out-and-out economic growth. Moreover, the constitution is likely to condition the policy-making of the next administration, even in the absence of legal requirements, as citizens' expectations will be for government to follow through on the new text. Two candidates appear clear favourites to make it through to the second round of the presidential elections, which are due for December. Although opinion surveys should be taken with a pinch of salt given their poor recent track record of predicting political outcomes in Chile. The first is Gabriel Boric of the left-wing Apruebo Dignidad coalition. His policies are likely to dovetail with the new constitution. He's likely to ramp up social spending notably, increasing taxes, and attempt to replace the private pension system with a public one. The second is right-wing José Antonio Cast, who would likely double down on the current liberal economic model by cutting taxes and the size of state. This could potentially pit him against the new constitution, resulting in legal challenges against his government as well as social unrest. More centrist candidates, Jasna Provoste and Sebastian Sichel, are currently polling well behind the frontrunners, but were they to win the presidency, they would also boost government spending, but without displacing the private sector's role in the economy. One thing to bear in mind is that the country's current institutional architecture could hamper future reforms. Frictions between the executive and an opposition-controlled Congress have caused political gridlock in recent years, and this is likely to continue ahead in the absence of an overhaul of the country's political structure as part of the new constitution. And what's the near-term economic upshot while the constitutional process is ongoing? Well, uncertainty over the country's future economic model is likely to dampen investor intentions next year. And if it emerges that the constitution will shift the country far to the left and adopt a number of populist measures, the Chilean peso could come under pressure. Now let's take a look at Colombia. Parliamentary elections will take place in March next year, while presidential elections will take place in May, with a potential runoff in June if no candidate secures over half the vote in the first round. Current centre-right President Iván Duque is barred from running, and the final list of candidates who will compete for the presidency will not be defined until the presidential primaries next March. There are currently dozens of candidates still in the mix. As such, the contest is still wide open, although Duque's elevated disapproval rating amid the fallout from a botched initial attempt at tax reform earlier this year could open the door to a left-wing candidate assuming the presidency. Indeed, although it is still very early days, polls suggest left-of-centre Gustavo Petro, current senator and former mayor of Bogota, is the most popular candidate. He has spoken about moving Colombia away from a reliance on the extraction of oil and coal and raising taxes on the wealthy, and would likely boost social spending. However, his scope to boost the size of the state could be limited by an already large fiscal deficit and the need to hang on to the country's only remaining investment-grade credit rating after recent downgrades to junk status by Fitch and S&P. Finally, let's take a brief look at the 2022 outlook for key Latin American economies. We'll start with Argentina. Here, growth will slow sharply next year as the post-lockdown rebound fades, with unfavorable macroeconomic policies and rampant inflation also dampening economic potential. However, a recovery in tourism should provide some support. The potential breakdown in negotiations with the IMF is a key risk, as this deal is crucial to support investor confidence. Our analysts see growth of 2.2% next year, one of the slowest rates in the region, and inflation is seen ending the year at 47.9%. Now to Brazil, which is expected to be the slowest growing Latin American economy next year, as the commodity boom which has supported momentum this year fades. Much tighter monetary policy and investor uncertainty during the run-up to the elections will also play their part, although Bolsonaro could loosen the spending taps in an effort to gain votes, providing a near-term boost. A stalled reform agenda, the weak fiscal position, and socio-political tensions are risks. Our analysts have penciled in a 1.6% expansion for 2022. As for inflation, we see it dipping from current levels, but remaining above the central bank's 3.5% target. Turning to Chile, growth will slow sharply in 2022 on a weaker base effect and less expansive fiscal and monetary stances. Uncertainty over the constituent process is also likely to keep investment fairly subdued. The outcome of the presidential elections could be important, though, given the candidates' radically different visions for the country. A victory for Boric could usher in higher government spending, for instance, potentially somewhat reversing the current government's fiscal consolidation plans. The fourth pension withdrawal is another driver of uncertainty over the outlook, as is renewed social unrest. Meanwhile, inflation should head back towards the central bank's 3.0% target, thanks to sustained rate hikes. In Colombia, while growth will slow, the country should still be one of the region's top performers in 2022, thanks to a healthy oil sector and solid consumer spending. However, the elections could cast somewhat of a pall over investor intentions in the first half. On the price front, inflation should move back into the central bank's 2 to 4% target range. In Mexico, growth is seen slowing in line with a maturing US economic cycle. An uncertain business environment is a key risk to the outlook, as President López Obrador is currently attempting to undo his predecessor's liberalizing reforms in the energy sector, threatening private investment in the sector and FDI more broadly. The current tight fiscal stance should become slightly less restrictive next year, though, as per the recent 2022 budget, which could provide some support. Inflation should dip markedly from its current level as supply constraints ease. In Peru, momentum will slow sharply next year as the base effect becomes much less favorable after a region-beating expansion in 2021. Moreover, business uncertainty over the policy direction under new President Castillo could dampen investment somewhat. While the president recently reshuffled his cabinet to give it a more moderate tone, in late October he called for the nationalization of an important natural gas deposit, for instance. As for inflation, it should be under control in 2022. In Venezuela, our analysts see a return to growth next year, but from a miserably low base effect. Higher average oil prices and a potential uptick in oil production should provide support, as should a reduction in inflationary pressures. However, economic conditions will remain extremely challenging. Although inflation will fall, it will remain excruciatingly high, while ineffective economic policies, ongoing emigration, and international isolation will hamper activity. Without a change of regime and lifting of US sanctions, the economy is unlikely to heal. So that brings us to the end of the webinar, and I just wanted to wrap up with our bottom line for the Latin American economy. After a tough 2020, the regional economy will recover some lost ground this year, although underlying economic conditions remain challenging in some countries and price pressures are intensifying. In 2022, growth is seen slowing sharply amid a loss of momentum in commodity markets and reduced stimulus from government and central banks, with risks seemingly skewed to the downside. Meanwhile, inflation is seen easing by end 2022, but only slightly. While on the political front, elections in Brazil and Colombia and the constitutional reform in Chile are the key factors to watch. Finally, the underlying picture of weak regional growth potential remains in place, and Latin America is expected to underperform other emerging markets next year, and in the years that follow, in the absence of deep structural reforms to education, labour markets, and tax systems. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar on the Latin American economy. This is Stephen Vergado, economist at FocusEconomics, and I hope you all have a great day.